less than and open curly bracket, closed curly bracket. Between these round brackets, we're going to put a Boolean value like true. And in between the curly brackets, Boolean value is true, then we're going to run the code in the curly brackets. If this Boolean value is false, then we're not going to run the code. If we save, the value between the brackets is true, so we're going to run this code and display hello. Now, if we change this to false and save, it will not run this code. So an if statement lets us decide whether or not to run some code based on this Boolean value. Now, if statements have another useful feature called else. Let's go to the end of this if statement and type else, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. And then inside these curly brackets, we're going to put some different code like console.log else. The way else works is if this Boolean value is true, the computer will run this code. Otherwise, we will run the code inside else. Let's give it a try. We'll change this Boolean value to true and save. And because it is true, it will run this code and display hello. Now, if this Boolean value is false and save, because it is false, it will not run this code, and it will run the code inside else and display else. So using if and else, we can write two groups of code and then decide which code to run. Now let's do a practical example. We're going to write some code to check if someone is old enough to drive. Let's go to the bottom and create some new lines. And we're going to type if, brackets, and curly brackets. And inside here, we're going to compare two numbers. The first number is a person's age. Let's pretend we have a person who is 30 years old. So we're going to type 30. Then we're going to check if this age is greater than or equal to the legal driving age. Let's pretend the legal driving age is 16. Notice that between the brackets, we don't have to just put a Boolean value. We can put any code that results in a Boolean value. So this comparison results in the Boolean value true. That means the computer will run the code between the curly brackets. So in here, let's type console.log you can drive. Now, if this is not true, let's run some different code. At the bottom, we'll type else and curly brackets. And then inside these brackets, we'll type console.log you cannot drive. Now let's save. And it will tell me that this person who is 30 years old can drive. If we go back and change this to a person that is 15 years old and save, this comparison will result in false. So it will display you cannot drive. So that's how we use if statements. We can write multiple groups of code for different situations and then decide which code to run. Now let's learn the syntax rules for if statements. To create an if statement, we type if, and then round brackets with a Boolean value inside. This is called the condition. If this condition is true, we will run the code inside the curly brackets. We can also add an else statement. This code will run if the condition is false. The else statement is optional. We don't have to have one. So these curly brackets and the code inside, these are called branches because it's like a tree branch. the code is splitting off into two directions, and we either run this code or we run this code. One more thing to know is in a branch, if we only have one line of code, the curly brackets are actually optional. So we can delete these and the code will still work. However, if we have more than one line of code in this branch, for example, if we add another line, console.log congrats, now this branch has two lines of code, so the curly brackets are mandatory. So we have to add them back. Now we're going to learn another feature of if statements, which is we can have more than one condition. For example, we're going to go to the end of this if branch and type else if, and then brackets and curly brackets. Else if lets us add another branch to our if statement. Between these round brackets, we can add another condition. For example, if a person is almost old enough to drive, let's display a different message. So inside this condition, let's check if this person's age, which is 15, is greater than or equal to 14. So we're checking if they are almost old enough to drive. And now inside the curly brackets, we're going to display a different message. Console.log almost there. So the way this works is that the if statement checks the conditions one by one. First, it checks if this is true. If it is, it will run this branch. Then it checks if this is true. If it is, it will run this branch. And if none of the conditions are true, it will run the else branch. So here, this condition is false, so we're not going to run this code. But now the second condition is true, so we're going to run this code. If we save, we display almost there in the console. So using else if branches, we can add as many conditions as we want to an if statement. The next thing we're going to learn is that we can combine if statements with variables from the previous lesson. For example, here we wrote the person's age 2 times. So we can actually save this age in a variable and then reuse that value. So above the if statement, let's create a variable using const, and let's name this variable age, and we'll make it equal to 15. Remember, the best practice for creating a variable is to use const by default, and only use let if we're going to change this value later. And now that we saved this number in a variable, we can use the variable inside the if statement. So we'll replace 15 with age, and here as well with age. So this will take whatever value is inside the variable and substitute it into the code. If we save, the if statement works the same way as before, and we run this line. Okay, now we're ready to use Booleans and if statements to do a project. We're going to build a rock, paper, scissors game. First, let's take a look at the project. We're going to go to our browser, and at the top, create a new tab, and we're going to type here super simple.dev/projects/booleans and press enter. Here, we can see a simple version of a rock, paper, scissors game. And if we click this link, it will take us to the final version of this game. So in this game, we can pick a move, and then the computer will pick a random move, and it will show us the result. And we also have a score of how many times we won, lost, and tied. So we're going to build this as we go through the course. But for now, let's go back, and we're going to start by building this simple version of the game. So how this simple version works is we click one of these buttons to pick a move. So let's pick rock. Then the computer will randomly pick a move. In this case, it's paper, but for you, it might be different. And it will compare the two moves and display the results in this pop-up. So the rules of rock, paper, scissors are rock beats scissors, paper beats rock, and scissors beats paper. Let's press OK, and we'll get started on this project. First, we'll create a new HTML file just for this project. Let's go to our code editor and click here and create a new file. And we're going to name this file 06-rock-paper-scissors.html and press enter. Next, let's copy all the code from booleans.html into this new file. So we'll open this again, and then Control A or Command A to select all the code, and then right-click, copy, and in here, right-click and paste. Let's close this and prepare this file. So we'll change this to rock, paper, scissors, and remove all of the JavaScript code that we had before. Finally, let's save and open this file in the browser by right-clicking and then open with Live Server. Let's take a look at the project again. So we're going to start by creating the text first, because this text is in the final version of the project. So in our HTML, we're going to create a paragraph element for this text. So less than p greater than, and the closing tag less than /p greater than. Inside our paragraph, we're going to have the text rock, paper, scissors. Next, let's create the buttons. So we'll go to our HTML and create a button. And inside this first button, we'll have the text rock. Let's create another button. This one will be paper. And we'll create the last button. This one will be scissors. Now let's save and check our new tab. And now we created all the elements that we need. Next, let's make these elements interactive with JavaScript. So when writing JavaScript, a good strategy is to think about what steps we need to do and then convert those steps into code. So here, when we click a button, the first step is the computer will randomly select a move, and then we're going to compare the moves to get the result. And finally, we'll display the result in a pop-up. By the way, this is called an algorithm. An algorithm is a set of steps to complete a task or to solve a problem. Now that we know what steps we need to do, we're going to convert these steps or this algorithm into code. First, we're going to run some JavaScript when we click these buttons. So let's use the onClick attribute again. We'll go to the opening tag of the button and type onClick equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we can add our JavaScript. So now we have to figure out how to randomly select a move for the computer. To do this, we need to learn a new piece of JavaScript code. So here, we're going to type capital M math.random, open bracket, close bracket. Math.random generates a random number between 0 and 1. So if we console.log this, console.log, and save, and click this button, and then check in our console by right-clicking, inspect, and the console, it will display a random number between 0 and 1. If we click this button again, it will generate a different random number. So every time we run math.random, it generates a different random number between 0 and 1. Now, to be more precise, It actually generates a number greater than equal to 0 and less than 1. Now let's save this random number in a variable so we can use it later. So we'll replace the console.log with const and then a variable name. Let's just name it random capital N number and then equals. So we saved this random number inside this variable. Next, we need a way to convert this random number into a move, like rock, paper, or scissors. To do this, let's imagine the space between 0 and 1, and then divide the space into 3 equal parts. Each part represents a move. If we generate a random number and it's between 0 and 1/3, the move will be rock. If it's between 1/3 and 2/3, the move will be paper. And if it's between 2/3 and 1, the move will be scissors. This is how we can convert the random number into a move. And this will give the computer an equal chance of picking rock, paper, or scissors. Now let's convert these steps into code. And an if statement is the perfect solution for this. This already looks like an if statement. So in our onClick attribute, let's add some new lines and type if, brackets, and curly brackets. For this first condition, we're going to check if the random number is between 0 and 1/3. So let's check if random number is greater than or equal to 0. But in this case, we also need to check that random number is less than 1/3, because we're checking if the number is between 0 and 1/3. But how do we do this? How do we check that two comparisons are both true? To do this, we're going to learn another type of operator in JavaScript called logical operators. Logical operators let us combine Boolean values, which is what we need to do here. Let's go back into booleans.html, and we're going to learn logical operators. So first, let's open the tab for this file, and we're going to comment out all the previous code so our console doesn't get too messy. /*, and then at the bottom, */. Now let's create some new lines. And the first logical operator we're going to learn is called the AND operator. Let's type console.log a Boolean value true and another Boolean value true. So this is the AND operator, and it checks if two Boolean values are both true. So it checks if the left side is true and the right side is true. That's why it's called the AND operator. So here, the left side is true and the right side is also true. So the AND operator will result in true. If we save, this displays true. Now, if one of these sides is false, for example, if we change this to false, now let's check, is the left side and the right side both true? In this case, no. So AND will now result in false. If we save, it now displays false. So that's the logical AND operator. It checks if the left side is true and the right side is also true. So this is exactly what we need for our project. For example, let's create a new line and type console.log. And let's say that we generated a random number like 0.2. And we want to check if it's between 0 and 1/3. So we can do 0.2 is greater than or equal to 0. And we're also going to check if 0.2 is less than 1/3. So we're using the logical AND operator to check if the left side is true and the right side is also true. So in this example, both sides are true. 0.2 is between 0 and 1/3. So if we save, this whole thing will display true. Now in the order of operations, logical operators like AND have a lower priority than math and comparisons. So in this example, it will calculate the math first, and then it will calculate the comparison on the left, and then the comparison on the right. And then at the end, the AND operator checks if both sides result in true. Now let's use the AND operator in our project. Let's go back to the file for our project. And then inside this first condition, we're going to check if the random number is greater than or equal to 0, and at the same time, is the random number less than 1/3. So this is how we check if a number is between 0 and 1/3. In this case, the computer will pick rock. So between the curly brackets, let's just type console.log rock. Let's get some practice and create the other two branches for picking paper and scissors. Feel free to pause this video if you want to try it yourself first. So here, we're going to type else if to add another branch, and then brackets and curly brackets. And in this condition, we're going to check if random number is greater than or equal to 1/3, and random number is less than 2/3. So if this random number is between 1/3 and 2/3, inside here, we're going to console.log paper. And finally, let's create another branch using else if random number greater than or equal to 2/3 and random number less than 1. And console.log scissors. If we save and then go back to our rock, paper, scissors tab, and then click the rock button a few times, it will pick some random moves for the computer. So that's how we generate the computer's move. One thing I want to point out is that I use the less than comparison instead of less than or equal to. I just did this so that the comparisons don't overlap. Before we continue in the project, we're going to learn two other logical operators we can use. Let's go back to booleans.html, and let's also open the tab for this file. The next logical operator is called the OR operator. For example, let's type some new lines and type console.log true or false. So this is the logical OR operator. It checks if at least one side is true. So it checks if the left side is true or the right side is true. That's why it's called the OR operator. So here, one of these sides is true, so the OR operator will result in true. If we save, this displays true. If both sides are true, it will also result in true, because at least one side is true. The last logical operator we're going to learn is called the NOT operator. For example, let's create a new line and type console.log exclamation true. So the exclamation is called the NOT operator. The NOT operator only uses one Boolean value, and it flips it into the opposite value. So if this value is true, the NOT operator will flip it into false. So if we save, this will result in false. Now, if you think about it, if we say that something is not true, that's the same thing as saying that it is false. So that's why this is called the NOT operator. Now, if we change the value to false, again, the NOT operator will flip this into true. So if we save, this will now result in true. So those are the logical OR and NOT operators. We don't need to use these in our project right now, but I'll leave some exercises for these at the end of this lesson. Now let's go back and continue the project. Let's open the code and open the tab. The next step is to compare the computer's move to our move, which is rock. So first, let's save the computer's move in a variable so we can compare it later. So instead of console.log, we're going to create a variable with const computer capital M move and make it equal to the string rock. And we'll do the same thing here. Const computer move equals paper. And here, const computer move equals scissors. And now at the bottom, let's console.log the computer move variable to make sure that it worked. If we save and then click our rock button, unfortunately, it gives us an error telling us that computer move is not defined, even though we created it right here. So what is happening here? If statements have a special feature. They create something called a scope. A scope limits where a variable exists. Basically, whenever we have these curly brackets like this, any variable we create inside the curly brackets will only exist inside the curly brackets. And we can't use these variables outside the curly brackets. So this is called a scope. Scopes are a feature of many programming languages, and they help us avoid naming conflicts. For example, if I create a variable here called random number equals 0.5, and this didn't create a scope, so if I delete these curly brackets, this variable name will now conflict with the variable name up here, because we can't have two variables with the same name. So you can imagine that if we didn't have scope and we had hundreds or even thousands of lines of code, we would quickly start to run out of variable names. So by creating a new scope here, all the variable names inside the scope only exist between the curly brackets, and it won't affect anything outside in the code. So scopes help us avoid naming conflicts. Okay, so I'll delete this example, and we'll learn how to access this variable outside of this scope. So to access this variable outside of the if statement, we have to create this variable outside of the if statement. So above here, we can create this variable. Const computer move. And let's just make it equal to the empty string for now. So this variable was not created inside any curly brackets. So it's accessible from all of this code inside the onClick attribute, including inside the if statement. And then inside the if statement, instead of creating a new variable, we're just going to save the move inside this variable up here, because we can access this variable anywhere else in the code. So instead of using const, we're just going to reassign computer move. And we're going to remove it here as well, and here as well. And remember, when we reassign a variable, we have to switch from const to let. And now if we save and then click the rock button, we're able to console.log computer move, because computer move is no longer inside this scope. It's up here. So we can access it in this line of code. So that's how scope works. Any variable that we create inside curly brackets will only exist inside the curly brackets. So remember in the previous lesson, we learned a third way of creating variables called var. The issue with var is that it doesn't really follow the rules of scope. For example, here, if we create a variable with var, like var and random number equals 0.5, this variable will conflict with the variable up here with the same name, even though it's inside a scope. So that's why we don't use var anymore, and we just use const and let, because var doesn't really follow the rules of scope. So we can remove this for now and move on to the next step. So we generated a random move for the computer. Now we have to compare our move, which is rock, to the computer's move to get the result and see who wins. To do that, we'll use another if statement. So at the bottom here, let's type if, and then brackets and curly brackets. And then inside this condition, let's check if the computer move is equal to rock. So remember, in JavaScript, we always use triple equals instead of double equals to avoid the conversion behavior. And now if the computer's move is rock and our move is rock, then inside the curly brackets, the result is going to be a tie. And let's save this string in a variable so we can use it later. Again, we have the same situation as before. We don't want to create the variable inside here because then it only exists in this scope between the curly brackets. Instead, we're going to create the variable above, outside the if statement. So we'll use let to create this variable because we're going to reassign it in the if statement. Let's name this variable result and just make it equal to the empty string at the top. And then in the if statement, we'll save the result into this variable. So result equals tie. Now let's create the other branches of this if statement. So here we'll add else if brackets and curly brackets, and we'll check if the computer move is equal to paper this time. If the computer move is paper and we picked rock, then we lose. So the result is equal to you lose. And finally, we'll add another else if brackets and curly brackets, and we'll check if the computer move is equal to scissors. And if the computer picked scissors and we pick rock, the result is that you win. So that's how we compare our move to the computer's random move using an if statement. The last step is to display this result in the pop-up. So at the bottom, let's create a pop-up using alert, open bracket, close bracket, and let's go back to super simple dev to see the message in the pop-up. So we'll click this, and in the pop-up, it shows our move, the computer's move, and then the result. So we can actually just copy this, right-click, copy, and then in here, right-click and paste. So obviously, the computer is not going to pick this move every time, and this is not going to be the same result every time. Instead, we want to insert computer move into here, and we want to insert result into here. So because we want to insert values, we're going to turn this into a template string using backticks. And now instead of paper, we're going to insert a value using $ and curly brackets, and we're going to insert the variable computer move. And instead of this text every time, we're going to insert the variable result. And now if we save, and we can click OK to close this and go back to our tab and click the rock button, we're going to pick rock. The computer will pick a random move and it will show us the result in a pop-up. So that's how we create this simple version of rock, paper, scissors. In our code, we did things step by step. First, we generated a random number. We converted it into a move for the computer. And then we compared our move to the computer move, and we displayed the result in a pop-up. So as you can see, when we're writing JavaScript, we first figure out what steps we need to do. This is called an algorithm. And then we convert these steps or this algorithm into code. So now we can actually remove this console.log because we don't need it anymore. And the last step is to make the other buttons here interactive. So feel free to pause this video if you want to try it yourself first. For the paper button, let's add some new lines to make it a little easier to read. And again, we'll add the onClick attribute. And then inside here, we can actually make a copy of all the JavaScript we wrote. So we can select all of this and then right-click copy. And then in here, right-click and paste. If the formatting doesn't look right, we can select all of these lines and press Tab to add indents until the formatting looks good. The one thing we have to change here is that now we picked paper, so the result is going to be different. If the computer picks rock and we pick paper, that means you win. If the computer picks paper, now it means that we tie. And if the computer picks scissors, that means you lose. And here we'll also change you pick rock to paper. And that's it. The last step is to make the scissors button interactive. So again, on click equals double quotes, and then we'll make a copy of the code. So I already have it, so just right click and paste. And then again, select the code that we need to fix the formatting for and press Tab. And here we pick scissors. So if the computer picks rock, then the result is you lose. If the computer picks paper, the result is you win. And if the computer also picks scissors, the result is a tie. And we'll change you picked rock to scissors. Now, if we save and try out our game, if we click rock, we're going to pick rock, computer picks a random move, and it will show us the result here. Let's press OK and try paper. This also works correctly. Let's press OK and click scissors. And this also works correctly. And that's it. We just finished creating a simple version of this rock, paper, scissors game. In the rest of this lesson, we're going to learn more details about Booleans and if statements. Let's go back to booleans.html and open the tab for this file. And let's comment out the previous code using /* and */ and create some new lines. The next thing we're going to learn is called truthy and falsy values. So if statements don't just work with Boolean values like true and false. They actually work with any type of value. This variable result and just make it equal to the empty string at the top. And then the result, let's check and we can access. And now a new variable, we're just going to save the move inside instead of creating a new variable of the if statement. So above here, so let's use the onClick attribute again. we'll go to the opening tag of the button and type on click equals double quotes. And then inside these double quotes, we can add our JavaScript. So now we have to
ሄሎ
አሎ ሩም አለ።
አዎ
ወደ ምሳ ሄዳ ነው በዛ።
አዎ ትንሽ እንዲያበለን እደውልልሃለሁ ትመጣለህ በልተን ነው እንሄዳለን ነው ወደዚህ ይሆናል
ኧረ አልበላሁም ገና።
እሺ እደውልልሃለሁ